My name is Samantha. I am 34 years old, and my 12-year-old daughter got home from school to find that her key no longer fit our front door. She sat 5 hours in the freezing rain waiting to be let in. When my mother finally stepped outside, she did not offer a single warm towel or an apology. She just looked at my shivering child and announced that they had decided we did not live there anymore. I did not shout or scream. I only looked at her and said one word: understood. 3 days later, she received a letter that destroyed her perfect reality. Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members. It was a Tuesday afternoon in Chicago, and the rain was coming down in sheets. I work as a forensic accountant, and I was in the middle of a high-stakes audit meeting for a corporate client. The conference room was tense. The discrepancies we were investigating were glaring, and my career demanded absolute focus. Then my phone buzzed on the table. I normally ignore personal messages during client meetings, but the name flashing on the screen caught my attention immediately. It was Mrs. Gable, the neighbor who lived across the street from the estate where my daughter and I resided. The text message was frantic. She wrote that Lily had been sitting on the steps of our guest house porch since she got off the school bus. It was barely 40 degrees outside, the wind was howling off Lake Michigan, and the rain was turning to sleet. My heart plummeted. Lily suffers from severe asthma. The cold, damp air is a massive trigger for her lungs, and prolonged exposure could easily provoke a life-threatening attack. Mrs. Gable tried to call out to her, but Lily just huddled tighter into her soaked jacket, refusing to leave the porch. I did not hesitate. I stood up, abruptly gathered my files, and walked out of the audit without offering any kind of explanation. My manager called after me, but nothing mattered except my daughter. I sprinted to the parking garage, my heart hammering against my ribs. The drive to the wealthy suburbs usually took 40 minutes. Navigating through the treacherous storm and congested Chicago traffic, it felt like an absolute eternity. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the heavy downpour. I kept frantically glancing at the dashboard clock, mentally calculating exactly how long my little girl had been out there. 2 hours. Then 3. By the time Mrs. Gable noticed her through the storm, Lily had already been exposed to the freezing elements for far too long. Panic clawed at my throat. I tried calling my mother Brenda, who lived comfortably in the main house just 50 yards away from our guest house. The call went straight to voicemail. I dialed my father Thomas. No answer. I called my sister Ashley, the golden child of our family. Nothing. The silence from my family was deafening, but it was not entirely new. Growing up, I was always the scapegoat expected to handle my own problems, while they catered to Ashley's every whim. But this situation was different. This was not a missed school play or a forgotten birthday. This was my child left out in freezing conditions right in their own backyard. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, praying that Lily had her emergency inhaler in her backpack, and that the bitter cold had not started to constrict her airways. The affluent neighborhood was a gray blur of manicured lawns and gated driveways as I sped through the residential streets. I turned onto our familiar road tires, splashing violently through deep puddles along the curbs. I pulled up to the grand wrought iron gates. The main house stood tall and imposing, its large windows glowing with warm light from the inside. I could see the silhouettes of people moving around in the living room, completely oblivious or indifferent to the nightmare unfolding, just steps away from their cozy fire. My eyes bypassed the main house completely and locked onto the smaller structure tucked away near the back gardens. The guest house. Our home. Through the curtain of rain, I saw a tiny figure huddled on the top step of the porch. It was Lily. She was curled into a tight ball, her knees pulled up to her chest, her thin windbreaker saturated and clinging to her fragile frame. Her backpack was clutched tightly against her stomach in a desperate attempt to shield it from the relentless downpour. She was shaking so violently that I could see the tremors from the driveway before I even put the car in park. I slammed the gear shift and leaped out into the freezing rain. I ran across the soaked lawn, my heels sinking deep into the mud, screaming her name. When I reached the porch, I dropped to my knees and pulled her freezing body into my arms. Her lips were a shade of blue, and her breathing was shallow, punctuated by the wheeze that every parent of an asthmatic child dreads more than anything else. "Mommy!" she gasped, her teeth chattering so hard the word was barely comprehensible. "My key! It would not turn. I tried so hard, but it just would not turn." I took the small metal key from her freezing fingers and jammed it straight into the lock of our front door. It did not budge. The entire mechanism was completely different. The locks had been changed. I stared at the shiny new brass fixture, the cold reality of the situation crashing heavily over me. We had been deliberately locked out. As I quickly wrapped my own warm, dry coat around my struggling daughter, the heavy wooden door of the main house creaked slowly open. My mother Brenda stood on the expansive covered porch of the main estate, perfectly sheltered from the raging storm. She wore a pristine cream-colored cashmere sweater that looked jarringly out of place against the backdrop of my freezing, gasping daughter. In her right hand, she loosely held a crystal glass of red wine. She took a slow, deliberate sip before her eyes casually drifted down to where I knelt in the mud holding Lily. There was no shock on her face. There was no maternal panic seeing her granddaughter turning blue. There was only a look of mild irritation, as if we were unwanted solicitors interrupting her peaceful Tuesday evening. I stared up at her, the rain stinging my eyes. I demanded to know what was going on and why the locks on our home had been completely replaced without warning. Brenda sighed heavily, shifting her weight and leaning against the ornate pillar of the porch. She looked at me with the exact same dismissive glare she had perfected during my entire childhood. She announced in a steady, unbothered tone that Ashley and Jamal were moving their things into the guest house. According to my mother, Ashley simply needed the space. Jamal was expanding his contracting business, and Ashley required a dedicated creative studio to support him and focus on her own wellness projects. My brain struggled to process the sheer audacity of her words. A wellness project. My 12-year-old daughter was shivering violently against my chest, her breath whistling through constricted airways, while my mother spoke about my sister needing a wellness studio. I asked Brenda how she could possibly think it was acceptable to lock a child out in the freezing sleet for 5 hours. I reminded her that Lily had severe asthma and that this kind of exposure was incredibly dangerous. Brenda waved her free hand dismissively, spilling a few drops of wine onto the patio stones. She claimed she had no idea Lily would be foolish enough to just sit in the rain. She stated that any normal child would have walked to a coffee shop or called a ride service. She then looked down her nose at me and said it was my own fault for not planning better. She insisted that I was a 34-year-old woman who should have checked my messages. I had been in a secure audit room with no signal, but Brenda did not care about the logistics of my demanding career. She only cared about catering to her golden child. I asked her where all of our belongings were. The furniture, the clothes, Lily's schoolbooks, and medical supplies. Brenda took another sip of wine and casually gestured toward the detached garage at the far end of the driveway. She said they had boxed up the junk and shoved it in the corner because Jamal needed a clean slate to begin renovating the guest house interior. She told me to grab whatever we needed and go find a hotel. She looked me dead in the eyes and delivered the crushing blow with a slight smirk. "We have all decided you do not live here anymore, Samantha. Ashley needs the space and you are dragging down the family energy." Through the large bay windows behind Brenda, I could see movement. Ashley walked into the frame holding a plate of gourmet appetizers, laughing at something someone had said. She did not even bother to look outside at the sister she had just rendered homeless, or the niece who was currently fighting for oxygen. Jamal briefly stepped into view, standing behind Ashley. He looked outside for a fleeting second, his face registering a brief flicker of discomfort, before Ashley handed him a piece of food and pulled his attention away. He did not step outside to intervene. He simply turned his back. The sheer cruelty of the moment threatened to break my composure. Every maternal instinct in my body screamed at me to march up those stairs, slap the wine glass out of Brenda's hand, and force my way inside the warm house so my daughter could breathe. The old Samantha, the one who spent years desperate for her family's basic approval and love, would have cried. She would have begged. She would have demanded to know why she was always the sacrificial lamb for Ashley's happiness. But I was no longer that frightened girl. I was a forensic accountant. I spent my days dismantling complex webs of corporate lies, tracking stolen assets, and destroying white-collar criminals with cold, hard facts. My mind immediately shifted from emotional devastation to calculated precision. I categorized the variables. Variable 1 was Lily's declining health. She was wheezing louder now, her small hands gripping my wet coat. Variable 2 was the immediate need for medical intervention. Variable 3 was the magnificent secret I held locked away in a Wyoming trust account. Brenda stood there waiting for the explosion. She wanted the drama. She thrived on seeing me lose control because it validated her twisted narrative that I was unstable and difficult. She wanted me to scream and cry so she could play the victim to Jamal and Ashley, pointing out how unreasonable I was being. She craved the satisfaction of watching me break down in the mud while she stood elevated and dry on her covered porch. I refused to give her that satisfaction. I tightened my grip around my daughter, shielding her from the biting wind. I slowly stood up from the mud, pulling Lily up with me. I kept my posture completely rigid, locking all the pain and rage behind a blank, expressionless mask. I looked past the warm, glowing windows, past Ashley laughing in the living room, and locked eyes directly with my mother. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I just looked at the woman who had birthed me, the woman who had just discarded her own granddaughter, like garbage, and delivered my response with chilling calm. Understood. Brenda's smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second. The complete lack of hysteria clearly unsettled her. She opened her mouth to say something else, to throw another insult or justification, but I had already turned my back on her. I did not look back. I carried my gasping daughter toward the car, leaving my mother standing on the porch holding her wine. She had drawn the battle lines, but she had absolutely no idea that she was standing on my property to do it. I threw the car into drive, and the tires spun against the slick mud before catching the pavement. The heater was blasting on maximum, but Lily was shivering so violently that her teeth clicked together in a terrifying rhythm. Her breathing was no longer just a wheeze. It sounded like air being forced through a crushed straw. I grabbed my phone and tossed it onto the passenger seat, demanding the voice assistant map the route to the nearest emergency room. 7 minutes. In a severe asthma attack, 7 minutes can mean the difference between life and irreversible brain damage. I hit the gas pedal hard. The heavy Chicago rain pelted the windshield so fiercely that the wipers could not keep up. I ran the first red light, leaning on my horn as a delivery truck swerved to avoid me. I did not care about traffic laws or the risk of an accident. The only thing tethering me to sanity was the sound of my daughter fighting for oxygen. I reached over and grabbed her freezing hand, rubbing it vigorously to generate friction. I told her to look at me and focus on my voice. Her chest heaved with tremendous effort, retracting deeply at her ribs and collarbone with every single inhalation. Her eyes rolled back slightly, and the blue tint around her mouth deepened into a horrifying shade of violet. The freezing rain had penetrated deep into her lungs, causing her airways to swell and close completely. Brenda and Ashley had done this. Their petty greed and staggering cruelty had physically assaulted my child. I pressed the accelerator closer to the floorboard, running another red light as the glowing red emergency room sign finally materialized through the storm. I slammed the brakes violently under the illuminated ambulance awning, screeching to a halt right in the drop-off zone. I did not bother turning off the engine or shutting the car door. I unbuckled my seatbelt, scooped Lily into my arms, and sprinted through the sliding glass doors. The sudden blast of sterile hospital air hit my wet clothes, but I felt no cold. I screamed for help. My voice echoed off the linoleum floors, carrying a raw, primal panic that instantly mobilized the triage staff. A triage nurse took one look at Lily's face and shouted a code for respiratory distress. Within seconds, a team of medical professionals descended upon us. A man in dark blue scrubs lifted Lily from my arms and placed her onto a rolling stretcher. They moved with terrifying speed, pushing the gurney down the brightly lit corridor toward the trauma bays. I ran alongside them, my soaked shoes squeaking against the polished floor. I recited her medical history, her age, her weight, and the agonizing fact that she had been locked outside in 40-degree sleet for 5 hours. The attending physician shouted orders for albuterol treatments, intravenous corticosteroids, and a continuous positive airway pressure mask. They pushed through a set of double doors into Trauma Room 3, and the reality of the crisis fully materialized. The room was a chaotic symphony of medical alarms and shouted commands. Nurses expertly stripped away Lily's saturated windbreaker and soaked shoes, replacing them with heated blankets. A pulse oximeter was clamped onto her small finger, and the monitor immediately began blaring a frantic, high-pitched warning. Her oxygen saturation was dangerously low. I stood pressed against the stark white wall of the trauma bay, completely helpless. A respiratory therapist strapped a clear plastic mask over Lily's face, forcing a thick white mist of medication deep into her failing lungs. Another nurse efficiently located a vein in her pale arm and inserted an IV line, pushing high-dose steroids directly into her bloodstream to combat the severe inflammation. I watched the frantic rise and fall of her small chest. Every gasp for air looked like sheer agony. The doctor stood by the monitor, his face drawn tight with concentration as he barked adjustments to the oxygen flow rate. The battle was entirely physical now, a war between modern medicine and the brutal damage inflicted by the elements. I crossed my arms tightly over my chest, digging my fingernails into my own skin to anchor myself to reality. I was a woman who could dismantle a fraudulent corporate ledger in hours, but right now I possessed absolutely no power. I could only stand in the sterile corner and watch strangers fight to keep my world from ending. The minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. The deafening hiss of the oxygen machine filled the room, drowning out the storm still raging outside the hospital windows. Slowly, miraculously, the frantic beeping of the monitor began to steady. The glowing numbers on the screen inched upward, climbing out of the critical danger zone. The violent heaving of Lily's chest gradually subsided into a smoother, less labored rhythm. The blue hue faded from her lips, replaced by a weak but healthy pink. The attending physician finally stepped back and let out a long breath, wiping sweat from his forehead. He looked at me and nodded, confirming that the medication was working, and the worst of the crisis had passed. I crumpled into a plastic visitor chair, the adrenaline suddenly draining from my body and leaving behind a profound, heavy exhaustion. I stared at my daughter sleeping fitfully under the heated hospital blankets. She was safe. She had survived. As the immediate terror receded, a new emotion flooded the empty spaces it left behind. The fear morphed into a cold, solid, and unbreakable fury. While my daughter was lying in a trauma bay fighting to draw her next breath, my mother and sister were 50 yards away, drinking wine and celebrating a stolen guest house. They had nearly committed murder for a wellness studio. I pulled my laptop bag onto my lap, resting my hands against the damp fabric. The tears were completely gone now. There was only the work ahead. I shifted my weight in the uncomfortable plastic hospital chair, the harsh fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. The trauma bay had been cleared of the frantic medical staff, leaving behind a heavy, sterile silence. The only sound remaining was the rhythmic, mechanical hiss of the continuous positive airway pressure mask forcing oxygen into my daughter's lungs. Lily looked impossibly small in the center of the massive hospital bed. The heated blankets were pulled up to her chin, and her chest rose and fell in a slow, steady cadence that finally offered a semblance of peace. The violet hue had completely left her lips, replaced by the pale exhaustion of a body that had just fought a brutal war for survival. I reached out and gently rested my hand against her warm forehead, grounding myself in the reality that she was alive. My own clothes were still damp from the freezing Chicago rain, clinging uncomfortably to my skin, but I refused to leave her side to find a dry shirt. I needed to stand guard. My phone vibrated violently in the pocket of my soaked coat. I flinched, pulling the device out with stiff, freezing fingers. I expected it to be a message from Mrs. Gable, the neighbor who had alerted me to Lily being locked out. Instead, the bright screen illuminated my dark corner of the room with a notification from the family group chat. The chat was ironically titled Family First. I stared at the glowing pixels, feeling a sudden wave of nausea wash over me. My mother, Brenda, my father, Thomas, and my sister, Ashley, were all active in the thread. For a brief, foolish second, a tiny remnant of the dutiful daughter inside me thought they might be reaching out to ask if Lily was safe. I unlocked the screen and opened the message thread. There was no apology. There was no panicked inquiry about my daughter's health. Ashley had sent a high-resolution photograph directly to the group chat. The image displayed the massive custom mahogany dining table inside the main house. The table was draped in a pristine white linen cloth and set with my mother's expensive fine china. In the center sat a massive platter of perfectly seared tomahawk steaks, surrounded by roasted asparagus and garlic mashed potatoes. 2 bottles of expensive imported red wine were uncorked and breathing next to crystal glasses. In the background of the photograph, the massive stone fireplace was blazing, radiating a cozy, luxurious warmth that sharply contrasted with the freezing storm still lashing against the hospital windows. Ashley and Brenda were visible at the edge of the frame, holding up their wine glasses in a celebratory toast. They were smiling brightly, their faces flushed with expensive alcohol and utter self-satisfaction. Directly beneath the photograph, Ashley had typed a long, gloating caption. She wrote that they were officially celebrating the expansion of Jamal's contracting business and her beautiful new wellness studio. She added a sparkling star emoji before continuing the message. The next sentence was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Ashley complained to the group about how exhausting her afternoon had been because she was forced to haul so much trash out of the guest house. She specifically described throwing my design monitors, Lily's carefully organized school binders, and our winter clothing into the damp, leaky corner of the detached garage. She ended the message by saying it took hours to clear out the heavy negative energy we had left behind, but the space finally felt cleansed and ready for her creative projects. My father, Thomas, quickly responded to Ashley's message with a thumbs-up emoji and a comment praising her for taking charge of her future. Brenda chimed in next, sending a heart emoji and stating that the guest house had always been meant for family members who actually contributed positive value to the estate. Neither of them mentioned the fact that they had forced a 12-year-old girl with severe asthma to sit in freezing sleet for 5 hours to achieve this aesthetic cleansing. Neither of them acknowledged the violence of ripping a child from her home without warning. They simply erased our humanity to justify their staggering greed. I scrolled closely on the photograph, examining the background details. Jamal was partially visible in the reflection of the large bay window. The hard-working contractor stood near the kitchen island, holding a plate of food. He did not look celebratory. His posture was rigid, his gaze cast downward away from the triumphant toast his wife and mother-in-law were performing for the camera. He had clearly enabled the lockout by moving Ashley's items into the guest house, but his body language suggested a man deeply conflicted by the cruelty unfolding around him. Yet his discomfort did not matter to me. He had stood by while a child was subjected to the freezing elements. Complicity was just as dangerous as direct malice. The sheer audacity of the group chat piled a thick layer of psychological warfare on top of the severe physical trauma we had just endured. They were explicitly trying to break my spirit. They wanted me to look at their luxurious steak dinner, their roaring fireplace, and their expensive wine and feel utterly defeated. They wanted me to feel the crushing weight of being the family outcast, the discarded single mother who could not even keep a roof over her sick child's head. Brenda and Ashley derived literal joy from my suffering, using my sudden homelessness as a source of evening entertainment. I lowered the phone and looked back at my daughter. The continuous positive airway pressure mask hissed loudly, pushing life-saving air into her recovering lungs. A stark, violent contrast existed between this sterile, traumatic hospital room and the lavish dining room in the photograph. My family was feasting on expensive steaks while my child was hooked up to heart monitors and intravenous steroid drips. They had actively chosen their convenience and vanity over my daughter's actual survival. The pain in my chest hardened, transforming from an agonizing wound into an impenetrable fortress of pure ice. The group chat pinged again. Ashley sent another message complaining that the garage roof was leaking directly onto the boxes containing Lily's winter coats, but joking that a little water never hurt anyone. A little water had just sent her niece into respiratory failure. I did not type a response. I did not block the number or leave the group chat. I needed to keep the channel open to monitor their monumental arrogance. I read the messages over and over again, letting the malicious words sear themselves permanently into my brain. The cruelty was no longer just a family dynamic, it was a confirmed tactical assault. I placed the phone face down on the small plastic table next to the hospital bed. The salt they had maliciously poured into my wounds did not cause me to break down or surrender. Instead, it acted as a powerful chemical catalyst, completely eradicating any lingering hesitation I harbored about my next steps. They believed I was a helpless victim, a disposable pawn they could simply evict from their grand narrative. They were celebrating a victory they had not actually won on a battlefield they did not even understand. The time for mourning the family I never truly had was officially over. I reached down to the cold, damp floor and unzipped my heavy laptop bag, preparing to execute the financial ruin of the people who had almost killed my daughter. The screen of my phone went black, but the image of that tomahawk steak and those crystal wine glasses remained burned into my retinas. The snap inside my chest was almost audible. It was not the sound of a woman breaking under the crushing weight of betrayal. It was the distinct metallic click of a heavy steel vault locking shut. Every ounce of grief, every lingering shred of daughterly duty, and every pathetic hope for parental love was instantly sealed away permanently. I placed the phone face down on the plastic tray table and pulled my heavy silver laptop from the damp canvas bag. The cold metal felt grounding against my palms. As the machine booted up, casting a harsh blue glow across my face, the internal transformation crystallized. I was no longer the discarded daughter sitting helplessly in a sterile hospital room. I was stepping directly onto my battlefield. I typed in my decryption password with rapid, aggressive precision. My fingers flew across the keyboard, fueled by a lifetime of forced independence. I had been entirely on my own since the day I turned 18. While my parents were busy funneling thousands of dollars into Ashley's private art tutors and European backpacking trips, I was working grueling double shifts at a downtown diner just to pay for my accounting degree. They had always treated me like a burdensome obligation rather than a daughter. My self-reliance was a survival tactic born from their absolute neglect. They never asked about my exams. They never attended my college graduation. They simply expected me to vanish into the background and handle my own existence so they could focus all their emotional and financial resources on their golden child. I opened my encrypted virtual private network, establishing a secure connection to my remote servers. That toxic dynamic only worsened when I left my abusive ex-husband 5 years ago. Instead of offering a safe harbor, my mother Brenda had openly scoffed at my divorce. She told me I was embarrassing the family image by failing to maintain a simple marriage. They shunned me completely during the darkest period of my life, treating me like a contagious failure, while simultaneously showering Ashley and Jamal with praise and financial gifts for simply existing. My independence had always been a massive threat to their need for control, so they actively weaponized it against me. They labeled me difficult and ungrateful to justify their blatant favoritism. They convinced themselves that I did not need their help because I was too stubborn. The truth was, I never asked for their help because I knew it would always come with a price tag of extreme humiliation. A normal person might have spent this night weeping over the cruelty of their own blood. A normal person might have drafted a long emotional message begging for basic human decency and an apology. But I am not a normal person. I am a forensic accountant. I spend my professional life hunting white-collar criminals, dissecting complex webs of shell companies, and finding the exact pressure points that make massive corrupt corporations crumble. My entire world revolves around indisputable data. Numbers do not lie. Numbers do not manipulate the truth. Numbers do not lock a 12-year-old child out in the freezing rain. I do not cry over betrayal. I follow the money. And I knew exactly where to start following it. I launched my primary analytical software, opening a blank spreadsheet that would soon become my execution block. I had always known my parents were incredibly reckless with their finances. Thomas was a man who cared entirely about projecting an image of extreme wealth, playing golf at the exclusive country club and buying custom-tailored suits. Brenda matched his vanity stride for stride, hosting lavish charity dinners while constantly complaining in private about the rising cost of property taxes. They had always lived dangerously close to the edge of their income, relying on credit cards and borrowed time to maintain the grand illusion of high society status. Ashley was a perfect reflection of their financial recklessness. She demanded luxury, but possessed absolutely no work ethic. The entire family functioned on a fragile house of cards, and I held the only match that could burn it to the ground. My fingers paused over the trackpad as I glanced back at Lily. Her chest was rising and falling steadily now, the intravenous medication fully expanding her constricted airways. The sight of her frail body tethered to those hospital machines fueled the cold, dark fire burning in my veins. Brenda and Ashley had assumed I was weak because I had spent the last 7 years quietly living in the guest house, keeping my head down and avoiding conflict. They mistook my strategic silence for absolute submission. They thought my decision to stay out of their way meant I was powerless against them. They had no idea that I possessed the exact skills necessary to dismantle their entire reality keystroke by keystroke. I cracked my knuckles and stretched my neck, bringing my focus entirely back to the glowing screen. The hunt was officially on. I bypassed standard public databases and logged directly into the premium financial tracing networks I utilized for corporate criminal investigations. I began pulling up every piece of data tied to my parents' names, their property history, known business associates, and credit profiles. I moved with lethal efficiency, organizing raw data into chronological digital files. I was no longer fighting for their approval. I was fighting for my daughter's safety. The apex predator inside me had fully awakened, hungry and incredibly focused. I watched the progress bars fill, downloading their history. I was about to give them an absolute massacre. The first progress bar hit 100% with a soft chime. I opened the initial batch of files, focusing first on the county property tax databases. Seeing the raw data laid out in black and white was staggering. Thomas and Brenda always projected untouchable suburban wealth. Their country club memberships and luxury cars were props in a lifelong stage play. But the digital footprint painted a completely different picture of deep, plunging desperation. I queried their checking and savings accounts using routing numbers I kept on file since helping them untangle their taxes 5 years ago. I bypassed standard security protocols using access points I legally utilized for deep forensic audits. The screen flooded with transaction histories from the past 24 months. I sorted the data by expenditure type and watched the horrific reality of their lifestyle materialize. Thousands bled out monthly to high-interest credit cards. They were drowning in retail debt, fine dining, and car maintenance fees. But that was just the surface. The real anomalies were hidden deeper. I narrowed my search parameters, filtering for large, outgoing wire transfers. My eyes scanned the screen, catching a repeating pattern of massive cash withdrawals. $5,000 here, $10,000 there. The money was being funneled directly into a joint account belonging to Ashley and her husband Jamal. I frowned, leaning closer to the glowing screen. Jamal ran a highly successful contracting business. He worked grueling 70-hour weeks, managing construction crews and securing lucrative commercial bids across the city. There was absolutely no logical reason he should need massive cash infusions from my financially unstable parents. I pulled up the public business filings for Jamal's contracting firm. The revenue streams were healthy, showing steady growth and incoming payments from major development projects. Jamal was bringing in serious capital. Yet when I cross-referenced his business accounts with Ashley's personal spending habits, the math completely collapsed. Ashley was burning through cash faster than Jamal could physically earn it. She drained his business accounts to fund her designer wardrobe, frequent spa retreats, and expensive dinners. She was treating his hard-earned corporate capital like a personal slush fund. But even Ashley's aggressive spending did not fully explain the massive black holes in my parents' own ledgers. I dug back into Thomas and Brenda's financial history looking for the catalyst that triggered their sudden extreme desperation. I traced their mortgage payments, running the numbers through an amortization calculator. A cold realization washed over me. They were not just behind on their credit cards. They had completely stopped paying their secondary property taxes 6 months ago. The county had already issued multiple delinquency notices, which they had clearly ignored or hidden. They were financially suffocating. The puzzle pieces began snapping together with terrifying clarity. The sudden decision to lock my daughter and me out in the freezing rain was not merely a petty act of cruelty born from my mother's narcissism. It was a panicked, calculated financial maneuver. They were completely broke. Ashley had drained Jamal's business dry, and my parents had exhausted every line of credit they possessed. They needed cash immediately to avoid total ruin and public humiliation. The guest house was not being cleared out for a wellness studio. That was a pathetic lie manufactured for the family group chat. They needed the guest house empty because they were plotting a much larger transaction. I opened another search portal, tapping into the regional real estate listings and pending commercial acquisitions. I filtered the search by our specific zip code and property boundaries. It took less than 3 minutes to find exactly what I was looking for. A massive tech development corporation had recently submitted a zoning proposal to the city council. They were planning to build a sprawling corporate campus just 2 miles down the road. The property values in our immediate area were poised to skyrocket. Developers were already quietly buying up adjacent lots, offering massive cash buyouts to homeowners willing to sell quickly and quietly. I pulled the corporate acquisition logs and found a pending offer associated with our estate's address. The tech developer had offered $2.5 million for the land. It was a staggering amount of money, an absolute lifeline for a family drowning in secret debt. Thomas and Brenda saw that offer and realized it could instantly wipe out their financial disasters and fund Ashley's lavish lifestyle for another decade. But there was a massive legal roadblock standing between their greed and that multi-million-dollar payout. They could not sell the property with tenants officially residing in the guest house. Any existing lease or residency claim would delay the corporate buyout and potentially kill the deal entirely. They needed me gone. They needed me erased from the property immediately without any legal warning or formal eviction process that could leave a paper trail. Throwing my 12-year-old daughter into the freezing storm was simply a brutal eviction tactic designed to force me out overnight. They were perfectly willing to risk Lily's life to secure their massive payout. The sheer sociopathic nature of their plan made the air in my lungs feel heavy. They were not just bad parents. They were absolute monsters operating under the guise of suburban respectability. I stared at the glowing spreadsheets, the digital proof of their impending ruin and their treacherous greed. They thought they had outsmarted me. They thought kicking me to the curb would clear their path to the millions they so desperately craved. I closed the real estate portal and opened a secure file labeled Wyoming Holdings. A sharp, humorless smile touched the corners of my mouth. They were so blinded by their own desperation that they had completely forgotten the most crucial detail of our entire financial history. They had forgotten who actually owned the ground they were standing on. I cracked my knuckles, the sound very sharp in the quiet hospital room, and prepared to drop the hammer. 7 years ago, the pristine facade of my parents' suburban kingdom almost completely collapsed. Thomas had taken a massive gamble on a strip mall development project, leveraging the main estate to secure the financing. The project failed spectacularly, and the bank moved to foreclose on the property. I remember the night Brenda and Thomas showed up at my tiny apartment, crying and begging for salvation. They had exhausted all their wealthy friends and Ashley was too busy backpacking through Europe on their credit cards to even answer the phone. They came to the daughter they constantly belittled because they knew I was making excellent money at my accounting firm. They asked for a massive loan to pay off the bank, promising they would pay me back with interest. I knew they were lying. I knew from years of watching them burn through cash that any money I handed them directly would simply vanish into their black hole of debt. But I also had a young daughter, and I wanted her to grow up in a safe school district. So I offered them a lifeline wrapped in ironclad legal tape. I told them I could not give them a personal loan, but I knew an independent corporate investment firm willing to buy the debt and purchase the property. The firm would then rent the estate back to them, allowing them to save face in front of their country club friends. To the outside world, it would look like they still owned their beautiful home. They agreed immediately, desperate to maintain their social standing. They signed a stack of dense legal documents, relinquishing all ownership rights to a holding company called Ironclad Properties, LLC, registered in the state of Wyoming. They eagerly handed over the deed, believing they had outsmarted the bank by securing a private corporate landlord. They assumed I negotiated a separate lease for the guest house, simply utilizing my corporate connections to secure a roof over my own head. What Thomas and Brenda never realized, what they were far too arrogant and financially illiterate to ever verify, was the actual structure of Wyoming corporate privacy laws. Wyoming allows limited liability companies to operate with complete anonymity. The state does not require the names of the managers or members to be listed on public filings. It is the ultimate legal shield for high-net-worth individuals who want to protect their assets from public scrutiny. Ironclad Properties, LLC, was not a faceless corporate conglomerate managing portfolios from a skyscraper. Ironclad Properties, LLC was me. I am the sole managing member and 100% owner of the entity holding the deed to the estate. I bought the property outright, saving my parents from public ruin and absolute homelessness. I allowed them to reside in the main house while Lily and I lived quietly in the guest house. Every single month for the past 7 years, Thomas and Brenda have dutifully submitted a massive rent check to a post office box in Cheyenne, Wyoming. They spent years complaining about the strict corporate landlords, raising their rent to match property tax increases, never once grasping the absolute irony of their situation. They paraded around the main house, throwing lavish dinner parties and boasting about their property values to their wealthy neighbors. They treated me like a pathetic charity case clinging to their guest house out of necessity. Brenda would constantly remind me how lucky I was that her corporate landlords allowed a single mother to remain on the premises. She loved flexing her imaginary authority, threatening to complain to the management company if I left my daughter's bicycles on the driveway. She genuinely believed she was the queen of the castle, generously tolerating a peasant in her backyard. The sheer monumental stupidity of their current plan was almost too massive to fully comprehend. Thomas and Ashley had seen the $2.5 million corporate buyout offer from the tech developer, and their greedy minds immediately went into overdrive. They believed they could quickly flip the property and secure a massive cash payout to erase their secret mountain of debt. But you cannot sell a house you do not actually own. You cannot execute a multi-million-dollar real estate transaction when your name is nowhere on the county deed. They thought kicking me out into the freezing rain was a brilliant tactical maneuver to clear the property of unwanted tenants before closing their imaginary deal. They threw my child into a life-threatening asthma attack to empty a guest house they had absolutely zero legal right to control. The absolute poetic justice of the moment sent a rush of cold, pure adrenaline straight into my veins. They had just illegally locked out the actual owner of the estate. They had just violently evicted their own landlord. I sat in the sterile hospital room listening to the steady hiss of Lily's oxygen mask and stared at the digital copy of the deed on my screen. The document bore the official county seal, confirming Ironclad Properties, LLC, as the sole owner. Thomas and Brenda had handed me the ultimate weapon 7 years ago, and their staggering arrogance had kept them completely blind to it. They were actively negotiating a massive real estate deal based entirely on fraud. They were digging a financial grave so deep they would never see the sun again. I closed the property file and opened a new folder on my desktop. The real estate revelation was just the first layer of their destruction. If they were reckless enough to try selling a house they did not own, they were definitely reckless enough to leave a trail of other financial crimes in their wake. I needed to know exactly how they planned to facilitate this fraudulent sale without the proper titles or ownership documents. I shifted my focus to the federal databases, preparing to uncover a crime that carried serious mandatory prison time. I shifted my focus to the federal databases, preparing to uncover a crime that carried serious mandatory prison time. My parents were completely broke, yet they had somehow managed to keep their country club memberships active and Ashley's luxury lifestyle funded for the past 2 years. The math simply did not align with their vacant bank accounts. There had to be an invisible revenue stream, keeping their fragile house of cards from collapsing. I opened a secure portal linked directly to the Small Business Administration tracking system. As a forensic accountant handling high-net-worth clients, I had authorized access to search federal loan disbursements using specific geographic parameters. I typed in the exact address of the estate and hit enter. The search results populated instantly, and the blood in my veins turned to absolute ice. The screen displayed a massive approved federal disbursement. It was a Paycheck Protection Program loan, a federal relief fund designed to save struggling businesses during the global health crisis. The loan amount was a staggering $150,000. The business listed on the application was a completely fabricated entity called Apex Consulting Group, registered directly to the main house address. I clicked on the guarantor details, expecting to see my father Thomas listed as the primary applicant. Instead, the name staring back at me from the glowing screen was my own. My hands hovered over the keyboard, frozen in pure disbelief. Thomas and Ashley had not just ruined their own finances, they had actively stolen my identity to defraud the United States government. I quickly downloaded the complete application packet, pulling up the scanned PDF documents submitted to the federal portal. I zoomed in on the signature line of the promissory note. There it was, an almost perfect replication of my signature. They had copied the loops and angles with terrifying precision, but it was definitely a forgery. The dates on the application coincided perfectly with a massive audit I had conducted out of state. I was physically in New York when this document was allegedly signed in Chicago. The mechanical reality of their betrayal began to piece itself together. For years, I had allowed my mail to be delivered to the primary mailbox at the front of the estate, grabbing my letters whenever I walked past the main house. Thomas and Ashley had weaponized that simple arrangement. They had actively intercepted my mail, filtering through my bank statements, tax documents, and credit card offers. They harvested my social security number, my clean credit history, and my spotless financial reputation. They used my identity as a shield to secure a massive federal bailout because their own credit scores were completely obliterated by secret debt. I opened my network tracing software and ran a deep diagnostic on the email address associated with the fraudulent loan application. The digital trail was sloppy, arrogant, and incredibly easy to follow. The IP address linked to the loan submission originated directly from Ashley's personal laptop. She had created the fake consulting company, drafted the fraudulent employee payroll documents, and submitted the application while sitting comfortably in the main house. Thomas had likely provided the initial idea and the forged signature, knowing my financial profile was strong enough to guarantee instant federal approval. They had conspired to commit massive identity theft against their own flesh and blood. I followed the money trail, watching the $150,000 hit a shadow bank account opened under my name. The funds did not stay there long. Within 48 hours, the money was systematically dispersed into multiple different accounts. $30,000 was wired directly to a luxury car dealership to pay off the remaining balance on Ashley's imported SUV. $20,000 went straight to the elite country club, clearing Thomas and Brenda's delinquent membership dues. The rest of the stolen federal money was aggressively funneled into the corporate accounts belonging to Jamal's contracting business. I paused, examining the ledgers associated with Jamal. The hard-working contractor had absolutely no idea his business accounts were being used to launder stolen federal funds. Ashley was manually injecting the fraudulent PPP money into his corporate revenue stream to make his business look artificially inflated. She would then immediately drain those same accounts to pay for her secret vacations, high-end jewelry, and hidden credit card debt. She was turning her husband into an unwitting accomplice to federal wire fraud. If the Internal Revenue Service ever audited Jamal, his contracting license would be permanently revoked, and he would be facing decades in federal prison for crimes his wife committed. The sheer scale of their depravity was breathtaking. This was no longer just a toxic family dispute over a guest house or a petty real estate hustle. This was a highly orchestrated criminal conspiracy. Wire fraud, bank fraud, aggravated identity theft, making false statements to a federal agency. These were not civil matters that could be settled with a slap on the wrist. These were severe felony charges, carrying mandatory minimum sentences in a federal penitentiary. Thomas and Ashley had crossed a boundary that could never be uncrossed. I looked over at Lily. Her chest was rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm, the oxygen mask finally doing its job. She had nearly died tonight because these criminals needed her out of the guest house to facilitate their next fraudulent scheme. They were perfectly willing to let an asthmatic 12-year-old freeze in the sleet to protect their illegal empire. The cold fury inside me crystallized into absolute lethal determination. I began compiling every single document, every forged signature, every IP log, and every illicit wire transfer into a heavily encrypted digital dossier. I meticulously labeled the file, identifying all the key players and their specific roles in the massive federal crime. I was building an execution block, and the blade was razor sharp. I prepared the secure transmittal protocol linking the completed dossier directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. I did not hit send yet. I needed them to feel the absolute terror of the trap snapping shut around their ankles. I needed to look them directly in the eyes when their entire world collapsed. I closed the federal portal and shifted my attention back to the local banking records. It was time to pull the final thread, unraveling the financial destruction Ashley had secretly inflicted on the only innocent adult living in that house. Jamal was about to learn the devastating truth about his wife. I opened the corporate registry files for his construction firm. Jamal was a good man. He was a brilliant and resilient African-American contractor who had built his business from absolute scratch. I remembered the thick calluses on his hands and the quiet pride in his voice whenever he talked about securing a new commercial bid. He worked grueling 70-hour weeks in the brutal Chicago weather to provide a beautiful life for my sister. He worshipped the ground Ashley walked on, completely blind to the venomous snake he had married. Ashley had convinced Jamal to let her handle the corporate bookkeeping, claiming her background in communications made her perfectly suited to manage his ledgers. He trusted her implicitly. That trust was his greatest mistake. I synced his corporate routing numbers with my forensic software and watched the horrific reality of his marriage unfold on my screen. Ashley was systematically bleeding his entire company dry. Every time Jamal deposited a massive payment from a completed construction job, Ashley diverted 30% of the funds into a hidden offshore account. She categorized these massive outgoing wire transfers as material costs and subcontractor fees. The fraudulent invoices she created were sloppy, but effective enough to fool a husband who was too exhausted from manual labor to double-check the spreadsheets. I tracked the diverted funds flowing out of the offshore account and hitting 3 secret credit cards registered solely in Ashley's name. She was dropping $10,000 a month at luxury boutiques on the Magnificent Mile. She was booking weekend getaways to exclusive wellness retreats in Sedona. But the most alarming pattern emerged when I filtered the recurring monthly charges. There was a steady leak of $5,000 consistently paying the lease on a luxury high-rise apartment in downtown Chicago. I ran the apartment address through the public utility registry. The tenant listed was a 22-year-old aspiring fitness influencer. I cross-referenced his name with Ashley's hidden social media accounts and hit the absolute jackpot. She was using a burner profile to comment on his photos. I dug deeper, pulling the digital receipts from the boutique hotels she frequented during her so-called wellness retreats. The secondary guest registered matched the personal trainer's name perfectly. Ashley was actively funding a secret double life, keeping a boy toy stashed in a luxury downtown apartment while her husband broke his back on construction sites to pay their bills. A wave of genuine pity washed over me for Jamal. He was a pawn in their twisted family game, unaware that his wife and his in-laws were actively destroying his financial future. If the federal government audited Jamal's company for the fraudulent PPP loan injection, he would lose his contracting license and face federal prison. Ashley was steering him straight into an active volcano without a single ounce of remorse. I needed to hand him the exact weapon he required to sever his ties with my toxic sister and save his own life. I opened a new, highly encrypted folder and labeled it with Jamal's name. I began compiling a bulletproof, devastating dossier. I downloaded every fraudulent invoice Ashley had created. I captured the wire transfers, the hidden credit card statements, the luxury apartment lease agreement, and the hotel receipts. I gathered undeniable photographic proof of her secret life, pulling the metadata to verify the times and locations. I formatted the information into a crystal-clear timeline that even a jury could understand in 5 minutes. The hospital room slowly began to brighten. I looked up from my screen and watched the first rays of morning sun pierce through the heavy gray clouds. The brutal Chicago storm had finally broken. The freezing rain had stopped, leaving behind a city washed clean. I looked over at the hospital bed. Lily was sleeping deeply, her chest rising and falling in a steady, strong rhythm. The respiratory machines beeped softly, a comforting sound of stabilized life. My daughter was going to be perfectly fine. Now it was time to ensure my family faced absolute ruin. I checked the clock on my laptop. It was 6 in the morning. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct cellular number of my primary real estate attorney, David. He was a ruthless, brilliant legal mind who handled all the acquisitions for Ironclad Properties, LLC. He answered on the second ring, his voice sharp and alert. I told David that my parents were attempting to fraudulently sell the estate to the tech developer using a forged signature. I informed him about the illegal lockout and the fact that my daughter was currently recovering in the emergency room because of their actions. David was furious. He immediately asked if I wanted him to dispatch the local police to the estate. I told him no. Involving the police right now would only result in a messy, chaotic scene where my mother could play the victim and spin her lies. I needed a tactical surgical strike. I needed them to gather all their arrogant pride into one room so I could decimate it publicly. I instructed David to draft a 72-hour emergency eviction notice for severe destruction of property and criminal fraud. I told him to pull the original certified deed of trust for the Wyoming LLC and have everything couriered to me by noon. I explained my exact plan to David. I was going to set a trap. I would give Brenda Thomas and Ashley the illusion of total victory today. I would make them believe they had successfully broken me. I thanked David and ended the call, closing my laptop. My family thought they had left me out in the cold to die. They were about to finally learn what happens when you lock a predator out of her own cage. By mid-morning, the pediatric specialist finally signed the discharge papers. Lily was exhausted, but breathing normally, her vital signs stabilized and strong. I helped her change into dry clothes a kind nurse procured from the hospital donation closet. I wrapped my arm tightly around her small shoulders as we walked out through the sliding glass doors into the crisp morning air. The storm had passed completely. I ordered a premium ride service, refusing to let my daughter anywhere near my damp car. We headed straight into downtown Chicago. I had already booked a sprawling 2-bedroom suite at a highly secure luxury hotel overlooking the river. We walked through the gilded lobby and took the private elevator up to our floor. As soon as the heavy wooden door clicked shut behind us, I felt a profound sense of relief. The suite was immaculate, warm, and entirely safe. I drew a hot bath for Lily, ordered a massive spread of comfort food from room service, and tucked her into a king-sized bed surrounded by plush pillows. I kissed her forehead and told her I had some brief business to handle regarding our old house. I promised her we would never have to go back to that dark place again. I instructed the front desk and the hotel security team that absolutely no one was allowed up to our floor under any circumstances. My daughter was protected in an impenetrable fortress. Now it was time to deploy the Trojan horse. I pulled out my phone and opened the family group chat. I needed to craft a message that perfectly mimicked the broken, desperate tone they expected from me. I needed to feed their massive egos until they were completely blind to the impending slaughter. I typed slowly, deliberately stripping away every ounce of my actual confidence. I wrote that Lily and I were safe, but currently staying at a cheap motel. I apologized for causing a scene the previous night. I told them I realized I had no other options and that I was completely exhausted from fighting. I typed that I knew they needed my signature for some real estate documents, and I was willing to sign whatever they needed if they would just give me a small cash advance to secure a new apartment. I asked if I could come by the estate at 5 o'clock to sign the paperwork and collect the boxes they had left in the garage. I hit send and waited. The response arrived less than 4 minutes later. Brenda could not resist the opportunity to gloat. She replied with a painfully condescending tone, stating she was glad I had finally come to my senses and decided to stop being so difficult. She told me to make sure I looked presentable because they were hosting a small gathering, but confirmed I could come to the main study to sign the documents and collect my check. The bait was taken. They swallowed the hook, the line, and the sinker. At 4:30, I received a secure courier package at the hotel lobby. It contained the exact legal documents David had prepared. The original Wyoming LLC deed of trust, the eviction notices, and the heavily encrypted drive containing the federal fraud evidence against my parents and the embezzlement dossier against Ashley. I slipped the documents into a sleek black leather briefcase. I changed into a sharp-tailored charcoal suit, pinned my hair into a severe twist, and applied a coat of dark red lipstick. I looked exactly like the corporate executioner I was. I drove my own car back to the suburban estate. As I pulled onto our street, I immediately noticed the sheer scale of their arrogance. The driveway was completely lined with expensive luxury vehicles. A professional valet stand was set up near the wrought iron gates. I bypassed the valet and parked my car directly on the pristine front lawn, letting my tires carve deep, muddy ruts into Brenda's precious landscaping. I grabbed my briefcase and walked toward the main house. The heavy oak front doors were wide open, spilling warm golden light and loud upbeat music out onto the porch. They were not just hosting a small gathering. Brenda and Ashley had organized a massive, lavishly catered housewarming party to celebrate Ashley reclaiming the guest house and their impending multi-million-dollar real estate deal. Waiters in crisp white shirts circulated through the grand foyer, carrying silver trays of expensive champagne and artisanal appetizers. The floral arrangements alone must have cost thousands of dollars. They were celebrating a victory funded entirely by stolen federal money and a house they did not even own. I stepped over the threshold and walked directly into the grand living room. The atmosphere was thick with overwhelming, suffocating arrogance. Dozens of wealthy neighbors, local business owners, and country club socialites mingled in small groups, laughing and clinking crystal glasses. In the center of the room, Ashley was holding court. She wore a stunning designer cocktail dress, loudly regaling a group of women with the story of her new creative wellness studio. She was playing the role of the triumphant visionary, claiming she had completely redesigned the guest house interior overnight. Standing near the massive stone fireplace was Brenda, holding a fresh glass of red wine, soaking in the compliments from her affluent friends. Thomas stood nearby, engaged in a deep, animated conversation with a man wearing a very expensive suit, whom I immediately recognized as a prominent local commercial real estate broker. They were actively discussing the corporate buyout. In the far corner of the room, looking entirely out of place, stood Jamal. He wore a simple button-down shirt, his broad shoulders tense, his face drawn with exhaustion. He watched his wife sip champagne and laugh with her friends, completely unaware that she was financing this entire opulent display with the very money he had broken his back to earn. My entrance silenced the room. The chatter of the guests died instantly as heads turned toward the foyer. The string quartet amplified the sudden hush gripping the crowd. I stood motionless, holding my black leather briefcase, my charcoal suit sharp. I did not look like the defeated single mother they expected. I looked like a lethal predator. Ashley was the first to react. She handed her champagne to a waiter and marched across the hardwood floor. She wanted to ensure everyone in the room witnessed my walk of shame. She stopped in front of me, planting her hands on her hips, looking me up and down with exaggerated pity. "Samantha," she announced loudly, "you actually showed up. I thought you would be too busy settling into whatever cheap motel you found for you and Lily." I did not break eye contact. I offered a slow, completely unbothered smile. Ashley turned toward her friends, making sure they caught every word. "It is just so exhausting dealing with her constant single mom struggles," she sighed theatrically. "We gave her the guest house out of the goodness of our hearts. We let her live rent-free because she could not build a real career. But no good deed goes unpunished. She completely trashed the place. I had to hire a cleaning crew to get the stench out." Soft murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some guests cast sympathetic glances at Ashley, while others looked at me with thinly veiled disgust. I kept my posture perfectly straight, resting my hands easily on the handle of my briefcase. I let her speak. I let her dig the hole deeper. Brenda glided over, joining the execution. She draped a comforting arm around Ashley's shoulder, letting out a dramatic sigh. She looked directly at her friends and the prominent real estate broker standing nearby. "You have no idea the toll this takes," Brenda lamented, her tone dripping with manufactured martyrdom. "We sacrificed everything to keep Samantha afloat. We opened our beautiful estate to her. We tolerated her intensely toxic energy. And how does she repay us? By throwing a massive tantrum, making a scene just because Ashley finally needed the space for her business expansion. It is draining having a child who constantly ruins the aesthetic of our lives." The real estate broker, a tall, impeccably dressed man, nodded sympathetically. "Family entanglements can certainly complicate property transitions," he murmured, adjusting his silver cufflinks. "It is a massive relief you are finally clearing the title, Mrs. Brenda. The developers at Horizon are very eager to break ground." I locked eyes directly with the broker, registering his silver name tag. Mr. Harrison. He was the middleman brokering the massive $2.5 million corporate buyout. He thought he was dealing with the wealthy owners of a pristine suburban estate. He had absolutely no idea he was standing in the middle of a massive federal fraud scheme. "I am glad you finally came to your senses, Samantha," Ashley sneered. "It is pathetic, really. Coming here begging for a handout just to sign a simple piece of paper. But I suppose when you have literally nothing left, you have to swallow your pride eventually. Just take the money Dad offers you and disappear. Jamal and I have actual business to conduct, and we cannot have you dragging down our brand anymore." I glanced across the room. Jamal was standing quietly in the far corner. His jaw was clenched tight, his dark eyes locked intensely on his wife. He heard every single word she just said. He heard her claim the guest house for his business expansion. He heard her brag about the money they were supposedly making. I saw the deep confusion etching heavy lines into his forehead. He knew his business was not expanding into this guest house. He knew he had not authorized any cleaning crews or commanded anyone to be evicted. The seeds of doubt were already taking root and fracturing his blind trust. I looked back directly at my sister and my mother. They were glowing, feeding off the attention and perceived power they held over me. They wanted me to shrink. They wanted me to shuffle toward the study like a beaten dog begging for a scrap. Instead of breaking down, I smiled wider, a calm, chillingly serene smile that deeply unsettled the surrounding guests. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself against their wild accusations. I simply validated their breathtaking arrogance. "You are absolutely right, Ashley," I said, my voice smooth and projecting clearly across the silent living room. I came here today to ensure that everyone gets exactly what they deserve. I even brought my own special pen. Brenda narrowed her eyes, clearly confused by my complete lack of submission, but she quickly masked her hesitation with a haughty sniff. "Well, let us get this over with," she said, waving her manicured hand toward the back hallway. "Your father is already waiting for you in the main study. Mr. Harrison, please come with us to verify the signature. We want to finalize the Horizon deal first thing Monday morning." Thomas stepped out from the long hallway holding a crystal tumbler of scotch. He looked flushed, triumphant, and impatient. "Get in the study, right now. Stop bothering our guests and let us handle this transaction." I nodded gracefully, maintaining my composure. I slowly adjusted my tight grip on my briefcase, feeling the leather warm against my palm. Inside it rested the certified Wyoming LLC deed, the federal wire fraud evidence, and the crushing financial dossier that would obliterate Ashley's marriage. They had gathered an audience of their most important peers. They had invited the exact real estate broker managing their fraudulent deal. They had unknowingly set the grand stage perfectly for their own absolute and unavoidable destruction. I stepped forward, following my father down the long, dark hallway, walking straight into the massive trap they thought they had set for me. I stepped over the threshold of my father's private study. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut behind us, sealing off the music and the chatter of the party. The room smelled strongly of expensive scotch and old leather, a manufactured scent designed to project authority. Thomas marched directly behind his massive executive desk, taking his seat with the exaggerated posture of a conquering king. Brenda and Ashley flanked him, standing like loyal lieutenants. Mr. Harrison, the real estate broker, hovered near the leather armchair, looking slightly uncomfortable with the familial tension, but eager to finalize his lucrative commission. I noticed the heavy door creak slightly as Jamal stepped into the room. He remained near the back wall, folding his muscular arms across his chest. He was clearly uncomfortable with this aggressive display of power, but his loyalty to his wife kept him anchored in the room. Thomas slammed his scotch glass down onto a stack of thick legal files. He did not offer me a seat. He reached into the center of the desk and violently shoved a single stapled document toward the edge. The bold black letters across the top read, "Quitclaim Deed." He tapped his index finger aggressively against the signature line at the bottom of the page. "Sign it," Thomas commanded, his voice rough with impatience. "We are done playing games, Samantha. You are going to release every single lingering guarantor right you have on this property right now." Brenda stepped forward, crossing her arms and looking down at me with supreme condescension. She claimed that my name had been unfortunately entangled in some archaic paperwork from 7 years ago when I allegedly co-signed a minor loan for the estate. It was a spectacular lie. I had not co-signed a loan. I had purchased the entire estate outright through my Wyoming LLC. But Brenda spun the narrative flawlessly for Mr. Harrison's benefit. She explained that the title company required my signature to clear a minor bureaucratic hurdle before they could finalize the sale to Horizon Tech. She made it sound like a trivial annoyance caused by my very existence. Ashley leaned against the bookshelf, checking her pristine manicure. She told me to stop dragging my feet. She boasted that Horizon Tech was paying $2.5 million for the land, and they were scheduled to break ground next month. She bragged about how the massive payout would fund her new lifestyle brand and Jamal's commercial expansion. I glanced back at Jamal. His brow furrowed deeply. He shifted his weight, looking at Ashley with a sudden flash of confusion. He had a successful contracting business, but he clearly knew nothing about receiving a massive cash injection from this real estate deal. Ashley had evidently kept him entirely in the dark about her actual plans for the money. Yet he remained silent, choosing to trust his wife over his own intuition. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat, offering a polite, professional smile. He stepped closer to the desk, adjusting his expensive tie. He assured me that this was a standard procedure in high-value commercial acquisitions. He explained that corporate buyers require an absolutely clean title free of any potential familial disputes or lingering guarantor claims. He stated that my signature on the quitclaim deed would permanently sever my legal ties to the property, ensuring a smooth transition of ownership to the tech developers. He spoke with the smooth, practiced cadence of a man who stood to make a six-figure commission on the sale. He was an unwitting pawn in their massive federal fraud scheme, blindly facilitating a transaction for a property my parents did not actually own. Thomas picked up a heavy gold-plated pen and practically threw it across the desk. It clattered against the wood and rolled to a stop right next to the fraudulent document. He leaned over the desk, placing his palms flat against the surface to intimidate me. He demanded I pick up the pen and sign my name. He reminded me that I had nowhere else to go and no power left to fight them. He claimed that locking Lily out in the freezing rain was a necessary tough love lesson to force my compliance. He explicitly stated that they had to evict me abruptly because the corporate buyers demanded a vacant property prior to the final closing date. He admitted to risking my daughter's life purely to secure his multi-million-dollar payout. The air in the study grew incredibly thick and suffocating. The sheer gravity of their collective delusion was astounding. Brenda smiled, her eyes gleaming with the anticipation of massive, unearned wealth. Ashley smirked, already mentally spending the millions she planned to steal. Mr. Harrison checked his luxury watch, eager to secure his commission and return to the party. Jamal remained silent, a quiet, imposing sentinel guarding the door. They all stood there waiting for the broken, defeated single mother to surrender. They expected me to lower my head, pick up the gold pen, and sign away my life to appease their staggering greed. I looked down at the quitclaim deed. The document was legally worthless in the context they were presenting. A quitclaim deed simply transfers whatever interest a person holds in a property to another party without any warranties of title. But Thomas and Brenda held absolutely no interest to receive. The entire transaction was a phantom built on a foundation of absolute lies. They needed my signature to trick the title company into believing the estate was legally theirs to sell. They were using me to finalize a massive crime. I reached out and let my fingertips brush against the cold metal of the gold pen. I did not pick it up. Instead, I kept my hand resting gently on the mahogany desk. I let the silence stretch deliberately. I watched a drop of condensation roll down Thomas's Scotch glass. I noted the slight tremor in Brenda's hand. Despite their aggressive posturing, they were absolutely terrified. They were drowning in debt, and this fraudulent sale was their only lifeboat. If I walked out of that room without signing, their entire world would instantly collapse. The bank would discover their delinquent taxes. The federal government would eventually catch their PPP loan fraud. Their country club friends would watch them lose everything. They were projecting immense power, but they were actually cornered rats. I slowly lifted my gaze from the fraudulent document. I looked at Thomas. I looked at Brenda. I looked at Ashley. And finally, I looked at Mr. Harrison, the man whose entire professional reputation was about to be obliterated by his association with this family. I picked up the gold pen, rolling it between my fingers. The metal was heavy and cold. Thomas let out a sharp breath of relief, believing I had finally submitted to his authority. Brenda stepped forward, preparing to snatch the signed document the second my pen left the paper. But I had absolutely no intention of signing my name in that private study. The execution needed a much larger audience. I tightened my grip on the thick handle of my black leather briefcase. Inside the secure compartment rested the certified Wyoming LLC deed and the explosive federal fraud evidence. My heart beat with a steady, rhythmic calmness. I was holding the absolute destruction of their entire existence in my left hand. I just needed to move them into the perfect position to deliver the final killing blow. I held the heavy gold pen in my right hand, letting its polished surface catch the warm light of the antique chandelier hanging above us. Thomas watched my fingers with hungry, desperate eyes. He completely misinterpreted my deliberate, quiet silence for hesitation. He thought I was holding out for a better deal, mentally weighing my shattered pride against my apparent destitution. He let out a harsh, scoffing breath, crossing his arms before reaching into the breast pocket of his tailored gray suit. He pulled out a sleek black leather checkbook and slammed it onto the mahogany desk. He grabbed a silver pen and hastily scribbled a figure across the paper, ripping the check from its binding with an aggressive tear. He slid it across the smooth wooden surface until it bumped directly against the fraudulent quitclaim deed. $5,000. Thomas announced, his voice dripping with absolute contempt and manufactured authority. Take it. Use it to find a cheap apartment for the kid and get out of our lives. It is more than generous, considering the massive, ungrateful inconvenience you have caused us this entire week. I looked down at the rectangular piece of paper. $5,000. That was the exact price tag he placed on his granddaughter freezing in the winter sleet. That was the absolute value he assigned to my complete submission and silence. It was a pathetic, insulting bribe funded by a desperately empty bank account that would likely bounce before the ink even dried. Ashley sauntered away from the tall bookshelf, her designer heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floor. She moved toward the ornate crystal bar cart positioned in the far corner of the room. She picked up a heavy green bottle of expensive vintage champagne and popped the cork with a festive, echoing crack that shattered the heavy tension in the study. She poured the bubbling golden liquid into a tall crystal flute, bringing it to her perfectly painted lips. She took a slow, deliberate sip and smirked over the rim of the glass. "You really should take the money," Samantha Ashley purred, taking another leisurely sip of her champagne while leaning against the bar cart. $5,000 is probably more cash than you have ever seen at one single time. You can finally buy Lily some decent clothes that do not look like they came directly from a charity bin. Just sign the stupid paper so Jamal and I can get back to our guests. We have actual important people waiting for us outside, and you are wasting our valuable time. Jamal shifted uncomfortably against the back wall. He crossed his muscular arms tighter across his broad chest, his dark eyes darting nervously between Ashley and the checks sitting on the desk. He was a man who built his entire life on honest, grueling physical labor. Watching his wife and father-in-law ruthlessly bully a single mother over $5,000 clearly disturbed his internal moral compass. Yet he remained a silent observer, trapped by his blind, unwavering loyalty to the woman pouring champagne in the corner. Mr. Harrison, the real estate broker, discreetly cleared his throat, checking his luxury watch for the third time. He was incredibly eager to finalize his multi-million-dollar commission and escape this suffocating, toxic family dynamic. I placed the heavy gold pen back onto the mahogany desk. It landed with a dull, definitive thud that instantly drew every single eye in the room. I did not touch the check. I did not touch the fraudulent deed. I looked directly at Thomas and offered a smile so completely devoid of warmth that he instinctively took a half step back toward the window. "I am not signing anything in this room," I stated, my voice perfectly level and utterly unyielding. Brenda let out a sharp, dramatic gasp of pure frustration. "Do not start this nonsense again, Samantha," she hissed, stepping forward with her hands balled into tight, trembling fists. "We are offering you a tremendous financial gift. You are completely out of options and resources. You will sign that paper right now, or I swear to God you will walk out of here with absolutely nothing." I picked up my black leather briefcase, gripping the handle with absolute authority. "I will sign your document," I lied smoothly, looking directly into Brenda's panicked, widened eyes. "But I will not do it hiding in the shadows of this private study like some shameful, dirty secret. If I am signing away my final connection to this sprawling estate, I am doing it out there." I pointed firmly toward the heavy mahogany doors leading back to the grand living room. "I want to do this in front of all your important guests. I want everyone to see this so there are no misunderstandings whatsoever about what is happening here today." Thomas's face flushed a deep, dangerous, angry red. He slammed his hand hard against the desk, rattling the empty glasses. "Absolutely not," he barked, his authority cracking. "This is a private legal transaction. We are not turning our business into a public circus just for your dramatic amusement." "Then the deal is completely dead," I replied, instantly turning on my heel and taking a deliberate, confident step toward the door. "I will walk out of here right now, and Mr. Harrison can tell the Horizon Tech developers that the property has a highly contested title. I am sure they will be thrilled to halt their multi-million-dollar project indefinitely, while we battle this out in civil court for the next 5 grueling years." Mr. Harrison's professional facade finally cracked wide open. He stepped forward, his hands raised in a desperate, placating gesture. "Now let us not be hasty," he urged, his voice thick with sudden, overwhelming panic. "Mr. Thomas, if your daughter simply wants a public acknowledgement of her concession to finalize the paperwork, perhaps accommodating her request is the most pragmatic path forward. We must secure that signature today to guarantee the corporate closing date and satisfy the buyers." Thomas and Brenda exchanged a frantic, desperate look. Their greed was a massive, blinding blinder. They were drowning in hidden, insurmountable debt, and the promise of a $2.5 million buyout was dangling just inches from their eager faces. They looked at me, standing resolute by the door, holding my briefcase. They assumed my demand was just a pathetic final cry for validation. They genuinely believed I wanted to stand in front of their wealthy friends and play the tragic, broken victim one last time before disappearing into poverty. They thought I was begging for a momentary sliver of the spotlight. They had absolutely no idea I was marching them directly to the execution block. "Fine," Thomas spat out the word like it tasted like pure poison. He aggressively grabbed the quitclaim deed and the $5,000 check from the desk. "If you want to humiliate yourself in front of half the neighborhood, you can go right ahead. Let us get this over with immediately." Ashley rolled her eyes, taking a large, obnoxious gulp of her champagne. "You are so unbelievably dramatic, Samantha," she sneered, following her angry father toward the door. Jamal fell into step behind her, his face a mask of silent, brooding tension. Mr. Harrison quickly followed suit, visibly relieved that his massive commission was safely back on track. I pushed the heavy mahogany doors wide open, letting the loud, upbeat music and the boisterous chatter of the party wash over us again. I walked out into the grand foyer, my posture perfectly straight, my dark red lipstick set in a cold, confident smile. The family trailed eagerly behind me, completely blinded by their staggering, unyielding greed. They walked willingly out of the study and straight into the trap I had meticulously built for them. The grand stage was finally set, and it was time to burn their entire empire to the absolute ground. I stepped into the center of the grand living room. The catered party was in full swing, but my sudden reappearance, accompanied by the grim faces of my family, immediately shifted the atmosphere. I walked directly toward the massive stone fireplace, claiming the absolute center of the room. Thomas marched right behind me, holding the fraudulent quitclaim deed and the pathetic $5,000 check. He signaled to one of the waiters to turn down the upbeat jazz music playing through the expensive surround sound speakers. The sudden drop in volume caused the remaining conversations to organically fizzle out. Dozens of wealthy neighbors, affluent country club members, and local socialites turned their attention toward us. They clutched their crystal champagne flutes and gourmet appetizers, their eyes darting curiously between my sharp charcoal suit and the tense, flushed face of my mother. Thomas puffed out his chest to reclaim his authority. He raised his hands, asking for the attention of everyone with a booming, jovial voice. He announced that before they continued celebrating the wonderful new studio of Ashley and their exciting upcoming real estate venture, they had to take care of a minor family formality. He painted a masterful illusion for the crowd. He spoke about how the family was generously helping me transition into a new phase of my life. He explicitly mentioned providing me with financial assistance to secure a modest apartment for Lily and myself. The crowd murmured in polite approval, nodding at the benevolent patriarch, taking care of his struggling single daughter. Brenda smiled proudly, wrapping her arm around the waist of Ashley, soaking in the unearned admiration of her wealthy friends. Thomas stepped right up to me and extended the clipboard holding the quitclaim deed along with the gold pen. He held the $5,000 check out for everyone to see, making sure the audience registered his supposed generosity. "Here you go, Samantha," he said, his voice dripping with condescending warmth. "Just sign the document, and you can take the money to get your new life started. We all wish you the absolute best." Mr. Harrison stood a few feet away, beaming at what he believed was the final hurdle. Jamal watched from the perimeter, his expression still deeply conflicted. I took the clipboard from the hands of my father. I looked down at the fraudulent document, the physical manifestation of their boundless greed and breathtaking cruelty. I looked up and met the gaze of several prominent guests, making sure I had their complete, undivided attention. I did not take the gold pen. Instead, I unclipped the paper from the board. I held the quitclaim deed up by its top edge, allowing the heavy silence in the room to build into an agonizing, suffocating tension. I grasped the crisp white paper firmly with both hands and pulled my hands apart. A loud, sharp tearing sound ripped through the quiet living room. I tore the document cleanly in half. Then I stacked the halves and tore them again. I let the shredded pieces of their multi-million-dollar salvation flutter down onto the pristine marble floor. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of wealthy spectators. The polite smiles vanished instantly, replaced by wide-eyed shock. Brenda let out a horrified shriek, stepping forward with her hands flying to her mouth. Thomas turned violently red, the veins in his neck bulging against his starched collar. "Are you completely out of your mind?" he roared, his benevolent facade instantly shattering into pieces. "I just offered you a way out. You are ruining everything." Ashley lunged forward, spilling her champagne on the expensive rug, screaming that I was an ungrateful, jealous failure who was trying to sabotage her perfect life. Mr. Harrison looked utterly panicked, taking a step toward the shredded paper. I ignored their screaming. I knelt down, unlatched my black leather briefcase, and pulled out a thick blue folder. I stood back up and pulled out a heavy document printed on premium stock paper bearing the raised gold seal of the Wyoming Secretary of State and the local county recorder office. I bypassed my screaming father and walked directly over to Mr. Harrison. I held the document out to the real estate broker. He hesitated before taking it, his eyes scanning the bold legal print. "Mr. Harrison," I said, my voice projecting clearly over the commotion so every single guest in the room could hear me. "I highly suggest you read the name of the managing member listed on that certified deed of trust before you promise the Horizon Tech developers a vacant lot. My parents have absolutely no legal right to authorize the sale of this estate. The holding company that rescued this property from foreclosure 7 years ago, Ironclad Properties LLC, is not an anonymous corporate entity. The sole owner and managing director of the investment firm is me." The entire room went completely dead silent. The only sound was the subtle rustle of Mr. Harrison flipping to the second page of the document, his eyes scanning the undeniable legal proof. His face drained of all color as he looked from the paper to Thomas and then back to me. "This is fully certified," Mr. Harrison whispered, his voice trembling with the realization that he had nearly facilitated a massive fraudulent transaction. "She is the legal owner of the estate." I turned to face my parents and my sister. Their arrogant expressions had completely evaporated, replaced by raw, unadulterated terror. The wine glass slipped from the fingers of Brenda, shattering against the marble floor, sending red liquid splashing across her designer shoes. Thomas opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He staggered backward, clutching his chest, staring at me as if I had just risen from the grave. Ashley shook her head violently, muttering over and over that this was completely impossible. The shock paralyzing my father finally shattered into explosive, panicked rage. He lunged forward, stabbing his finger through the air toward my face. He screamed that the document was a complete forgery and a vicious lie. He turned frantically to the surrounding guests, his voice cracking as he tried to perform damage control. He shouted that I was a bitter, vindictive woman who had fabricated this entire scenario to ruin their celebration. He begged Mr. Harrison not to believe a single word I said, insisting that his lawyers would have the fake deed thrown out by morning. The veins in his forehead throbbed dangerously as he desperately tried to rewrite the reality unfolding before his eyes. He demanded Jamal remove me from the house immediately. Jamal did not move a single muscle. Jamal stood like a statue sculpted from stone, his expression a mixture of profound shock and dawning realization. The facade of the perfect wealthy family was completely disintegrating, and he was finally seeing the ugly, rotting core hidden beneath the designer clothes and the forced smiles. The crowd of affluent neighbors and country club friends murmured nervously, backing away from my father. They smelled the desperation pouring off him like cheap cologne. I watched him flail a drowning man thrashing against the inevitable current. I did not raise my voice to match his screaming. I simply reached back into my open black leather briefcase. I pulled out a thick manila folder stuffed with heavy, glossy printouts. I held it up, letting the harsh overhead lights catch the official federal seals printed on the top pages. I told my father that if he wanted to discuss forgery, we should absolutely dive into the details. I informed the silent room that real estate fraud was merely the appetizer of their criminal endeavors. The main course was far more severe. I walked a few steps closer to where Thomas was desperately gasping for air, and I dropped the second bomb with lethal precision. I wanted them to feel the exact same cold helplessness that Lily felt when she was locked out in the freezing rain. I wanted them to understand they had picked a fight with a professional who dismantled financial criminals for a living. I announced loudly so that every single socialite and business owner in the room could hear the exact nature of their beloved friends. I explained that while they were pretending to be wealthy aristocrats, they were actually bankrupt criminals stealing from the federal government. I opened the manila folder and began reading directly from the financial tracing logs. I detailed how Thomas and Ashley had actively intercepted my mail, harvesting my social security number and clean credit profile. I stated clearly that on the 14th of October, they used my identity to fraudulently register a fake business called Apex Consulting Group, using this very estate as the primary operating address. Brenda let out a strangled gasp, grabbing the edge of the fireplace mantel to keep herself from falling over. I did not stop there. The execution required total exposure. I read the exact monetary figures detailing how they submitted a fraudulent Paycheck Protection Program loan application to the Small Business Administration. I told the room that they forged my signature on the federal promissory note to secure $150,000 in relief funds, meant for struggling small businesses. I turned my gaze directly to Ashley, who was trembling so hard her knees knocked together. I pointed out that the digital footprint for the fraudulent application traced back directly to the IP address of her personal laptop. She had submitted the federal paperwork while sitting in the comfort of the main house, thinking she was entirely untouchable. I listed the exact dates the illicit funds hit the shadow bank account and exactly how they dispersed the stolen money. I named the $30,000 payoff for Ashley's luxury SUV and the $20,000 wire transfer used to clear Thomas and Brenda's delinquent country club dues. I watched the faces of their wealthy friends contort in absolute disgust as they realized they had been dining with common thieves. The entire room shifted dynamically. The elite social circle they had spent their entire lives cultivating the people they had ruthlessly sacrificed my mental health to impress were now looking at them as if they carried a highly contagious disease. There was no sympathy to be found in the grand living room. Thomas tried to speak, but only a pathetic croaking sound emerged from his throat. He clutched his chest, his face drained of all color. I calmly closed the manila folder and tapped the cover with my index finger. I looked at my parents and casually mentioned the final devastating detail. I told them that a forensic accountant never builds a case without submitting it to the proper authorities. I announced that a fully encrypted digital dossier containing every forged signature, every IP log, and every bank transfer had been expedited directly to the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division at exactly 8 o'clock that very morning. I informed them that federal agents were likely already drafting the indictments for wire fraud, bank fraud, and aggravated identity theft. The impact of the word federal hit my father like a physical bullet. The last remaining shred of his arrogant pride instantly vaporized. Thomas physically collapsed backward, missing the edge of the sofa and crashing heavily into a patterned accent chair. The chair slid across the hardwood floor with a harsh scraping sound before hitting the wall. He slumped over, burying his face in his trembling hands, pulling violently at his gray hair. Brenda began hyperventilating, her breaths coming in rapid, shallow gasps that echoed terribly in the quiet room. She slid down the side of the stone fireplace, her perfectly styled hair falling wildly around her face as her knees gave out. She clawed at the collar of her expensive dress, desperately gasping for air that her panic-stricken lungs could not process. The surrounding guests recoiled, taking several large steps backward, completely abandoning my parents. No one rushed forward to help them. They were instantly ostracized, infected by the undeniable stench of federal felonies. My gaze swept over the ruined remnants of my parents before landing on Jamal. I left Thomas gasping and Brenda sobbing. My work with them was complete. I turned away from the wreckage of my parents and locked eyes with Jamal. He stood rigidly by the grand arched doorway. His broad shoulders were tense, and his calloused hands were clenched into tight fists. He had watched the federal fraud revelation with the horrified shock of a man standing in a minefield. He knew his wife was involved, but did not understand the true depth of her betrayal. I reached into my briefcase one final time. I bypassed the standard files and pulled out a thick red folder. The bright crimson color was deliberate, signaling a massive hemorrhage of funds. Ashley stopped hyperventilating long enough to notice the red folder. Her eyes darted from my hands to her husband. Pure panic finally broke through her arrogant facade. I walked across the Persian rug, my heels clicking sharply until I stood directly in front of my brother-in-law. I held the red folder out to him. Jamal looked at it like an explosive device. I spoke in a steady, quiet voice meant only for him, but the silent room allowed every word to carry. I told Jamal that he was a brilliant, hardworking contractor who had built a remarkable company. I told him he deserved respect and absolute transparency. I instructed him to open the folder. Jamal swallowed hard and took the heavy file. He flipped open the cover. I began to methodically guide him through the financial slaughter his wife had orchestrated. I pointed to a consolidated spreadsheet of his corporate revenue. I explained how Ashley used her role as bookkeeper to systematically bleed his contracting firm dry. I showed him the forged subcontractor invoices and fabricated material costs she manually entered into his accounting software. I explained that every time he deposited a massive payment, Ashley siphoned 30% of his capital into a hidden offshore account. Jamal stared at the highlighted bank routing numbers, his breathing growing heavy. His dark eyes scanned the undeniable proof of his missing wealth. Ashley suddenly let out a piercing shriek. She lunged across the living room, her designer heels slipping wildly on the polished floor. She threw herself at Jamal, clawing frantically, trying to rip the documents from his hands. She screamed that I was a jealous liar, trying to ruin her marriage with fabricated bank statements. She begged Jamal not to look at the papers, swearing she would explain everything in private. Jamal did not flinch. He did not look at her or acknowledge her frantic screaming. He simply raised his massive left arm and effortlessly blocked her grasping hands, pushing her back with a firm, impenetrable wall of physical distance. His eyes remained glued to the financial records. I continued my brutal narration over the sound of my sister sobbing. I directed his attention to the second section, exposing the 3 secret premium credit cards registered under his name but controlled entirely by Ashley. I read aloud the staggering balances she had accumulated buying designer handbags and funding her relentless shopping addictions. I informed him that his household was buried under crushing hidden debt. Ashley fell to her knees, weeping hysterically and violently, pulling at the hem of her very expensive cocktail dress. She pleaded with Jamal, promising she would pay it all back. She begged him to completely forgive her massive financial mistakes. But a financial mistake is missing a tax deadline. What Ashley had done was a prolonged campaign of domestic treason. I stepped closer and told him to turn to the final section of the red folder. I told him the stolen money was not just going toward designer clothes. I instructed him to look at the recurring monthly payments of $5,000. I watched profound confusion wash over his face as he read the lease agreement for a luxury downtown high-rise apartment. I explained that the tenant living in that expensive penthouse was a 22-year-old fitness influencer. I directed him to the digital hotel receipts pulled from her solitary wellness retreats in Sedona. The secondary guests listed on every single invoice matched the influencer perfectly. I pointed to the glossy photographs included at the back of the folder. They were undeniable images pulled from her burner profiles with verified location metadata, aligning perfectly with the days Jamal was working consecutive overtime shifts. Ashley was financing a lavish secret life with a young lover. I stood perfectly still, watching the catastrophic realization hit Jamal. He slowly flipped through the glossy photographs of his wife, embracing another man in luxury hotel suites paid for by his own sweat. The heavy red folder trembled slightly in his calloused hands. The unconditional love that had always softened his features whenever he looked at Ashley evaporated instantly. The transformation was terrifying to witness. The warmth in his dark eyes completely vanished, replaced by an endless, bottomless void of absolute fury. His jaw locked so tightly that a muscle twitched violently against his cheekbone. He did not yell. He did not throw the folder or curse at the sobbing woman groveling at his feet. The profound silence radiating from him was far more dangerous than any screaming match could ever be. He stared at the photographic proof of his destroyed marriage while Ashley wailed desperately, grabbing at his pant leg. She cried that the photos meant nothing and that she only loved him. Her pathetic lies echoed in the massive living room, bouncing off the walls of a house she had tried to steal from me. I had handed Jamal the undisputed truth, and he was finally processing the staggering magnitude of his wife and her deception. He gave her his entire heart, his complete trust, and the fruits of his relentless labor. She rewarded him with financial ruin, federal complicity, and blatant infidelity. The absolute finality of his hardened gaze signaled the end of her entire world. The absolute finality of his hardened gaze signaled the end of her entire world. Jamal looked down at Ashley. His face held no sorrow. It held only absolute, unadulterated disgust. He slowly reached across his body, gripping the thick gold wedding band on his left hand. He twisted the metal, sliding it off his finger with deliberate, chilling finality. Ashley let out a strangled wail, begging him to stop. She scrambled forward, her manicured hands slipping on the polished marble floor. Jamal did not say a single word. He did not yell or curse or demand an explanation. The silence he maintained was the most brutal punishment he could have possibly delivered. He simply held the ring over the expensive crystal flute Ashley had abandoned on the side table. He let go. The heavy gold band dropped into the bubbling champagne with a distinct ringing clink. It sank straight to the bottom, settling among the rising bubbles. Jamal turned his back on the sobbing woman. He picked up the red folder holding the undeniable proof of his shattered life and walked with heavy, measured steps directly toward the grand front doors. He stepped out into the cool evening air, walking away from the estate and his toxic marriage without looking back a single time. Ashley collapsed completely onto the floor. Her shrill, hysterical sobbing echoed off the high ceilings, piercing the ears of every single wealthy guest remaining in the room. She curled into a pathetic ball, staining the expensive Persian rug with her tears and ruined makeup. No one rushed to comfort her. Her affluent country club friends, her neighbors, and Mr. Harrison, the real estate broker, all began a rapid, silent exodus. They backed away toward the foyer, retrieving their coats and slipping out the front doors as quickly as humanly possible. The massive housewarming party, the celebration of their stolen victory, was entirely over. They were fleeing the radioactive fallout of a family exposed as federal criminals and domestic traitors. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with the impending police investigation or the total financial ruin crashing down upon the estate. I watched the last of their high society audience hurry out into the driveway, their luxury vehicles speeding away into the night. The grand living room suddenly felt cavernous and incredibly empty. The upbeat jazz music had been completely turned off, leaving only the sound of Ashley gasping for air on the floor and my father Thomas wheezing heavily in his chair. I turned my attention away from my ruined sister and focused my gaze entirely on my mother. Brenda was still slumped against the massive stone fireplace. Her pristine, cream-colored dress was stained with the red wine she had dropped earlier. Her carefully curated image of the untouchable, wealthy matriarch was completely destroyed. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a pathetic, desperate terror. I walked slowly across the room, my heels clicking methodically against the marble floor. I stopped right in front of her. I opened my black leather briefcase one final time. I reached inside and withdrew a stiff, formal legal document printed on bright yellow paper to denote its urgent statutory nature. I held it out to her. Brenda stared at the yellow paper, her hands shaking so violently she could barely lift them to take it. She looked at me, her voice trembling uncontrollably as she asked what it was. I told her to read the bold print at the top of the page. I informed her that the document was a formal 72-hour eviction notice mandated and authorized by the state of Illinois. I explained that standard eviction proceedings usually take 30 to 60 days, requiring a lengthy court battle. However, the law provides an expedited legal mechanism for landlords when tenants engage in severe destruction of property or active criminal behavior on the premises. I pointed out that locking a child out in the freezing sleet, destroying my personal belongings in a leaky garage, and operating a fraudulent business entity from the property address easily met every single legal requirement for immediate statutory removal. I told her that she had exactly 3 days to pack whatever belongings she could fit into her vehicle and vacate the premises entirely. I explicitly stated that if she, Thomas, or Ashley were still inside the property boundaries when the clock expired, the county sheriff deputies would physically remove them and drag their remaining possessions out onto the front lawn. I reminded her that the tech developers from Horizon would not be buying the property, and the federal government would soon be seizing whatever assets they had left to recover the stolen loan funds. They were facing absolute total ruin. Brenda looked down at the yellow eviction notice, her hands trembling violently. She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. She begged me to reconsider. She pleaded using the exact same manipulation tactics she had relied on her entire life. She cried that we were family, that we shared the same blood, that a daughter could not possibly throw her own mother out onto the street. She asked me if I really intended to leave them with absolutely nothing. I looked down at the woman who had tormented me for my entire existence. I thought about the night I rushed home through the freezing Chicago rain. I thought about finding my 12-year-old daughter blue and gasping for air on the porch. I remembered standing in the mud begging for mercy and receiving only a cold, arrogant stare while she sipped her wine. She had told me we no longer lived there. She had told me to go find a hotel. I did not scream at her now. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of anger. I looked her dead in the eyes, projecting the absolute freezing 0-degree chill of the brutal storm she had forced my daughter to endure. I mirrored her exact posture from that night, letting the heavy, deafening silence stretch for a long, terrible moment before I delivered my final verdict. Understood. Exactly 72 hours later, the skies over Chicago opened up once again. The weather was a bitter 40 degrees, and a heavy, relentless rain washed over the affluent suburban neighborhood. I sat inside my warm, dry car parked discreetly across the street from the grand wrought iron gates of the estate. The heater was running quietly, blowing warm air over my hands as I gripped the leather steering wheel. I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the front lawn and the massive mahogany doors. At precisely 8 o'clock in the morning, 2 marked county sheriff vehicles turned onto the street. Their tires splashed through the deep puddles, sending sheets of dirty water onto the manicured grass. A large box truck belonging to a court-appointed eviction crew followed closely behind them, parking directly in front of the property line. The deputies did not bother ringing the bell politely or waiting for an invitation. They marched up the front steps, heavily armed and completely devoid of patience. Because the eviction involved documented criminal fraud and severe destruction of property, the court had granted an expedited, merciless execution. There was no grace period. There were no extensions. The heavy oak doors swung open. I watched through the rain-slicked windshield as Thomas stepped out onto the porch, waving his arms frantically. He was wearing a silk bathrobe, his face red and distorted with panic as he tried to argue with the armed officers. He pointed wildly toward the guest house, making frantic gestures as if trying to explain his imaginary real estate deal. The deputies simply stepped past him, entering the grand foyer with absolute authority. Minutes later, the physical removal began. Ashley was the first one forced out of the house. She stumbled down the porch steps wearing thin satin pajamas and clutching a single designer handbag against her chest. Her face was streaked with running mascara, and she was sobbing uncontrollably as the freezing rain instantly saturated her clothes. Two hired eviction movers followed right behind her, carrying large black plastic trash bags. They did not gently place her items on the covered porch. They carried the bags directly out to the open lawn and dumped them into the mud. Designer shoes, expensive dresses, and luxury cosmetics tumbled out into the freezing sleet. Ashley fell to her knees in the wet grass, desperately trying to shield her ruined wardrobe from the downpour, just as my daughter had tried to shield her school backpack. Thomas and Brenda were escorted out next. Brenda was shivering violently, her pristine cream-colored sweater clinging to her frail frame. She looked around the neighborhood, her eyes wide with terror, hoping none of her country club friends were watching through their windows. Thomas clutched a small metal lockbox, likely containing whatever meager cash they had left from their drained accounts. The deputies instructed them to stand on the public sidewalk, entirely removed from the property boundaries. They were officially trespassing if they stepped back onto the grass. The movers continued their relentless work. They dragged out expensive antique chairs, custom artwork, and Persian rugs, tossing them onto the saturated lawn. The heavy rain pounded against the velvet upholstery, soaking the luxury items until they were completely ruined. I watched a massive gust of wind blow across the yard, knocking over a tall stack of Ashley's blank canvases and expensive painting supplies. The rain washed away the expensive pigments, leaving behind ugly, muddy streaks across the pavement. The visual symmetry was absolute perfection. They had thrown my heavy design monitors and Lily's winter coats into a leaky garage without a single ounce of remorse. Now, their entire superficial existence was drowning in the mud for the whole world to see. Several cars drove slowly down the street, the drivers tapping their brakes to witness the spectacle. I saw Mrs. Gable, the kind neighbor who had initially texted me about Lily standing on her front porch, holding a cup of coffee. She watched Brenda shivering on the sidewalk with a look of quiet, profound judgment. The affluent community was watching the complete social execution of the family that had pretended to rule the neighborhood. Brenda tried to hide her face behind her wet hands, but there was nowhere to hide. The grand illusion of their massive wealth was shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. Ashley crawled through the mud trying to gather her ruined designer heels. She was gasping for air, her chest heaving as the freezing wind whipped her wet hair across her face. I stared at her from the comfort of my heated car. I remembered the blue tint on Lily's lips and the terrifying wheeze in her lungs. I felt absolutely no pity for the woman crying in the sleet. She was finally experiencing the exact same helpless freezing terror she had intentionally inflicted on a sick child. The universe had delivered the exact punishment they deserved, and I had simply provided the legal mechanism to facilitate it. Thomas stood near the curb, arguing uselessly with a deputy. He pointed at the sky, pointing at the ruined furniture, demanding they wait for the rain to stop. The deputy shook his head and handed Thomas a clipboard, forcing him to sign the official eviction confirmation. The state did not care about his ruined leather sofa or his saturated ego. The law was cold-blind and utterly indifferent to his pathetic entitlement. The rain intensified, washing the last remnants of their dignity into the storm drains. Brenda hugged her arms across her chest, her teeth chattering so hard I could almost hear it from across the street. They had completely frozen me out of their hearts decades ago. They had frozen my daughter on that very porch. Now the freezing chill of reality was penetrating their bones. I put my car into drive, slowly pulling away from the curb. I did not roll down the window to gloat or wave goodbye. I simply drove past them, leaving them entirely alone in the storm they had created. Their era of arrogant cruelty was officially washed away forever. The legal fallout from that rainy morning was swift and absolutely brutal. The encrypted digital dossier I submitted to the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division triggered an immediate federal response. Forensic accountants quickly verified my findings. Less than 2 weeks after the eviction, federal agents pulled up to the cheap roadside motel where Thomas and Brenda rented a cramped room. They arrested Thomas right in the parking lot. He was formally indicted by a federal grand jury on multiple felony counts of wire fraud, bank fraud, and aggravated identity theft. The government immediately seized his remaining bank accounts and placed a massive federal lien on any future earnings. Thomas was denied bail, establishing him as a severe flight risk. His country club friends quickly erased his contact information, and the commercial real estate broker completely denied ever associating with him. Thomas was entirely erased from the high society world. The destruction of Ashley was equally comprehensive. Jamal did not hesitate after walking out of the estate with the red folder. He hired a ruthless family law attorney and filed for an expedited contested divorce. Armed with the undeniable financial ledgers, hotel receipts, and photographic evidence of her infidelity, Jamal secured a massive legal victory. The family court judge took one look at Ashley's lack of legitimate income, her involvement in a federal fraud scheme, and her reckless pattern of draining corporate accounts to fund a secret young lover. The judge awarded Jamal sole physical and legal custody of their children. Ashley was granted strictly supervised visitation for merely 4 hours a month. Jamal immediately filed a massive civil lawsuit against Ashley for corporate embezzlement and breach of fiduciary duty. He legally severed her from any claim to his contracting business, ensuring she would never touch another dime of his hard-earned capital. Ashley was left with absolutely nothing. She was completely buried under $70,000 of secret credit card debt. The golden child who had mocked my single mother's struggles was now a destitute pariah living on an air mattress in a motel room with her disgraced mother. Brenda was left to face the horrific ruins of her shattered empire completely alone. With her husband sitting in a federal holding cell and her favorite daughter facing a massive civil lawsuit, Brenda realized she had run out of wealthy friends to manipulate and fraudulent assets to liquidate. The staggering reality of extreme poverty crashed down, forcing her to abandon her arrogant pride. She resorted to the only tactic she had left. She began calling my phone incessantly. The woman who had callously told me to go find a hotel while my 12-year-old daughter turned blue in the freezing sleet was now desperately seeking a lifeline from the very child she had violently discarded. Her calls came in at all hours of the day and night. When I refused to answer, she began leaving a string of pathetic weeping voicemails. Her haughty, commanding cadence had been replaced by a shrill, hysterical tremor. She sobbed into the receiver, begging for financial assistance. She pleaded with me to pay for an expensive criminal defense attorney for Thomas. She asked me to wire money to cover their weekly motel rent. The psychological manipulation in those voicemails was incredibly transparent. Brenda repeatedly invoked the concepts of blood ties and unconditional family love. She cried that a daughter could not possibly let her own mother suffer in squalor. She swore that she had always loved me deep down, and that all her past cruelty was simply a series of tragic misunderstandings. She begged for a chance to sit down and heal our fractured family. I sat at the kitchen island of my secure luxury hotel suite, holding my phone in my hand, listening to her voice echo through the quiet room. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I did not feel a sudden surge of familial duty, or a desire to rescue the woman crying on the other end of the line. I only felt a cold, profound emptiness. I remembered the exact look on her face when she stood on that covered porch, holding her crystal glass of red wine. I remembered her looking down at Lily shivering in the mud and telling us we no longer lived there. Brenda did not believe in blood ties when she authorized changing the locks on my home. She did not believe in unconditional family love when she helped Thomas forge my signature to defraud the federal government. She only believed in the concept of family when she needed a shield to protect herself from the devastating consequences of her own actions. She was not crying because she felt genuine remorse for abusing me. Her apologies were nothing more than a calculated transactional currency, and I absolutely refused to accept counterfeit money. I let the final voicemail play out to the very end, listening to her desperate, breathless pleading until the recording automatically timed out. I tapped the screen of my phone, pulling up the blocked contacts menu. I selected my mother, my father, and my sister. I hit the delete button, erasing the voicemails entirely from my digital storage. I did not send a final text message explaining my decision. I did not write a long letter detailing my justified anger. Brenda Thomas and Ashley had lost the right to my words the moment they locked a sick child out in the freezing storm. I permanently blocked their numbers, shutting the heavy steel door on their existence forever. The boundary I established in that moment was completely absolute. There would be no future reconciliation. There would be no holiday reunions or hesitant phone calls years down the road. They were legally, financially, and emotionally dead to me. The execution was completely finished, and the air in my lungs finally felt remarkably clean. 6 months later, the bitter freezing rain of that Tuesday afternoon felt like a lifetime away. The seasons had changed, and so had the entire landscape of my existence. The multi-million-dollar commercial real estate transaction with Horizon Tech proceeded with absolute flawless efficiency. Once Thomas, Brenda, and Ashley were forcefully removed from the premises, the title company found zero remaining encumbrances on the estate. The developers were thrilled to finalize the acquisition of the land, and Mr. Harrison, the broker, handled every single piece of paperwork with terrifying precision. He had witnessed my absolute ruthlessness firsthand in that grand living room, and he made absolutely certain that my closing process was the smoothest transaction of his entire career. When the final wire transfer cleared the glowing screen of my primary banking application, showed a massive deposit of $2.5 million. It was clean, legal, and entirely mine. The fortune that my toxic family had desperately tried to steal to cover their criminal debts was now the impenetrable foundation of my new life. I did not waste a single second looking back at the suburban estate that was currently being demolished by bulldozers to make way for a corporate campus. I took my massive payout and immediately purchased a luxury high-rise condominium right in the heart of downtown Chicago. I paid entirely in cash. The new property was a breathtaking sanctuary hovering 50 stories above the bustling city streets. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, unobstructed view of Lake Michigan. But the most important feature of the condominium was not the imported marble countertops or the custom hardwood floors. The most important feature was the absolute state-of-the-art security. The building employed a highly trained 24-hour concierge service and a dedicated security team. Access to the private elevators required a biometric scan and a coded key fob. No one could walk onto the property without my explicit digital authorization. I had built a luxurious fortress for my daughter, and no one would ever have the power to lock us out or threaten our safety again. Lily thrived in our new environment with a speed that brought happy tears to my eyes. Without the constant underlying stress of walking past the main house and enduring the hostile glares of her grandmother and aunt, her entire demeanor changed. The severe asthma attacks that used to land her in the emergency room became a thing of the distant past. We found a brilliant pediatric pulmonologist in the city who optimized her treatment plan, but the true medicine was the profound peace of our new home. Lily no longer had to bundle up and cross a freezing yard, feeling like a discarded burden. She had a massive sunlit bedroom decorated exactly how she wanted it. She joined a competitive robotics club at her new prestigious middle school and spent her weekends having friends over for movie nights. The dark circles of anxiety completely vanished from under her eyes, replaced by the bright, confident spark of a child who finally felt entirely safe and unconditionally loved. Sitting on my expansive balcony, sipping premium coffee and watching the morning sun glitter across the lake, I spent a lot of time reflecting on the fundamental truth about family. Society constantly pushes a dangerous, highly manipulative narrative. People will tell you that blood is thicker than water. They will insist that you must forgive your parents because they gave you life. They will demand that you make peace with your siblings because you share the same genetic history. I reject that philosophy completely and absolutely. Toxic blood is not a bond. Toxic blood is a severe aggressive disease. When a person develops gangrene in a limb, a surgeon does not try to negotiate with the rotting tissue. The surgeon does not ask the healthy tissue to compromise with the infection or keep the dying limb attached out of a sense of physical loyalty. The surgeon amputates the limb with swift, brutal precision to save the rest of the body from a fatal systemic failure. My biological family was a terminal infection. Brenda, Thomas, and Ashley functioned as parasites, extracting my financial resources, my emotional energy, and my daughter's physical safety to sustain their own selfish, vain existence. They weaponized my loyalty and viewed my independence as a direct threat to their control. Forgiving them would have been a deliberate act of self-destruction. Cutting them out permanently, using the cold, hard mechanics of federal law and property rights, was the only available cure. I did not just survive their betrayal. I surgically removed them from my timeline and used their massive failure to build an empire of my own. The silence in my life now is incredibly beautiful. My phone never rings with demands for emergency cash bailouts. There are no condescending lectures about my life choices. There are no terrifying dashes to the hospital because my child was used as a pawn in a real estate hustle. There is only the quiet, wonderful rhythm of a successful career, a happy, healthy 12-year-old daughter, and the absolute certainty that I am the sole architect of my own destiny. I defeated the monsters of my past, not by screaming or crying, but by executing a flawless, calculated strike that left them with absolutely nothing. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you had to use the legal system to completely destroy a toxic family member who tried to ruin your life? Have you ever had to drop the hammer on someone who mistook your quiet patience for weakness? I want to hear all about your victories and your survival stories. Tell me exactly how you cut the toxic disease out of your life in the comments section down below. Your stories of resilience are incredibly powerful. If my journey resonated with you and gave you the courage to stand your ground against abusive relatives, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. There are plenty more stories of absolute justice and sweet karma coming your way. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video. The harrowing story of Samantha and her daughter Lily offers a profound and unflinching lesson about the true nature of familial bonds and the absolute necessity of self-preservation. For generations, society has perpetuated the romanticized notion that blood is thicker than water, demanding unconditional loyalty to our biological relatives regardless of their behavior. However, this narrative powerfully dismantles that myth, teaching us that sharing DNA does not give anyone the right to subject you to abuse, exploitation, or relentless cruelty. The core lesson learned here is that toxic family dynamics cannot be healed through endless compromise, silent suffering, or passive endurance. When relatives continuously demonstrate that they view you as a disposable asset rather than a loved human being, continuing to seek their validation only enables your own destruction. Samantha's journey illustrates that true strength does not lie in lowering your head to keep a manufactured peace. Instead, ultimate power is found in recognizing your own worth, erecting impenetrable boundaries, and using every logical tool at your disposal to fiercely protect your peace. We learn that love must be demonstrated through consistent actions, not merely demanded through familial entitlement. When those who are supposed to protect you willingly leave you out in the cold, literally and metaphorically, you owe them absolutely nothing in return. Cutting off toxic family members is not an act of vengeance. It is a necessary surgical amputation to save your own life and the lives of the innocent children relying on you. It takes immense courage to walk away from the people who raised you, but doing so creates the space needed to build a life of genuine safety, authentic success, and profound emotional freedom. If you are currently trapped in a toxic family dynamic, take that crucial first step today and start building the boundaries that will finally set you free.